Ladies and gentlemen, permit me, please, to claim your attention for a moment.
In the words of Winston Churchill, in the Second World War, every bond between man and man was to perish. Crimes were committed by the Germans under the Hitlerite domination to which they allowed themselves to be subjected, which find no equal in scale and wickedness with any that have darkened the human record. The wholesale massacre by systematized processes of 6 or 7 millions of men, women and children in the German execution camps exceeds in horror the rough and ready butcheries of Genghis Khan, and in scale reduces them to pygmy proportions. Deliberate extermination of whole populations was contemplated and pursued by both Germany and Russia in the Eastern War. The hideous process of bombarding open cities from the air, once started by the Germans, was repaid 20-fold by the ever-mounting power of the Allies, and found its culmination in the use of the atomic bombs which obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This video is sponsored by Skillshare. The first 500 people to use the link in the description will get their first 2 months for free. Skillshare is an online learning community that you can use to expand your horizons. With thousands of classes in design, business, technology and more, Skillshare has something for everyone. From how to take the best photographs at night to tips on presenting, you will get classes from experts in their fields, ensuring you have high quality teaching for the subjects you enjoy. With an annual subscription of less than $10 a month, premium membership gives you unlimited access to these high quality classes, so you can improve your skills, unlock new opportunities and do the work you love. And since Skillshare is sponsoring this video, the first 500 Life Guide viewers to use the link in the description will get their first 2 months for free. Click on the link in the description and start learning today. 20s and 30s. After the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the preceding Great Depression, the world was plunged into economic turmoil and Germany was hit hard. American banks withdrew the loans they had made to Germany and the economy collapsed overnight. Due to such large reductions in cash and capital, banks struggled to provide money and credit, and so in 1931 there were runs on German and Austrian banks, with several of them closing. Businesses closed at an alarming rate, and by 1933 unemployment had reached 6 million. Many people were left homeless and thousands of children died from malnutrition. A lack of government resolve, and out of despair, many turned to alternative political leaders and parties in the hope their problems would be solved. One man in particular garnered a lot of attention from his rousing speeches, and this man was Adolf Hitler. Hitler's speeches delivered clear culprits for Germany's problems. The November criminals who had signed the armistice ending World War I, the liberals and socialists who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, the communists who threatened revolution in Germany, and finally the Jewish bankers who plotted to undermine and destroy the German state. The Nazi and Communist parties both clashed violently, and Hitler claimed to be the only one to bring about order and end the Red Plague. As a powerful and gifted public speaker, Hitler was able to capitalize on public discontent. His party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, grew to record levels. In September of 1930, the Nazi Party had increased its representation in the Reichstag, the German parliament, almost tenfold, winning 107 seats, and only 2 years later in 1932, they won 230 seats, becoming the majority in parliament. Hitler had found the failures and misery of the Great Depression to his advantage, stating for hard reality has opened the eyes of millions of Germans. In the 1932 election, Hitler also ran for president, and although he lost to decorated war hero Paul von Hindenburg, his rising popularity gave President Hindenburg no choice but to appoint Hitler on the 30th of January 1933 as Chancellor of Germany, head of the German government. Just 1 month after Hitler had been sworn in as Chancellor, a fire was started in the Reichstag by a young Dutch communist who was then used to paint all communists as the enemy of Germany. Using Article 48 of the Constitution, the Reichstag fire decree was passed that abolished civil liberties such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Shortly after, Hitler created a secret police known as the Gestapo, helping him to suppress any and all opposition. As Chancellor, he also tripled the size of the German military, violating the Treaty of Versailles, banned all rival parties, killed political opponents, and prohibited Jews from working, voting, and occupying public spaces. After the death of President von Hindenburg in 1934, Hitler declared himself Führer of Germany, absolute dictator. Hitler believed the world to come would be dominated by four main superpowers. Germany was to be the main hegemonic power of mainland Europe, the British maintaining their international empire. The Japanese, or the Aryans of the East as Hitler liked to call them, would be the main power in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and finally America would dominate the Western Hemisphere. Part of Nazi support was their opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, and upon coming to power, Hitler promised to return Germany to its rightful place in the world. Hitler's objectives were clear. The economy needed to be self-sufficient, and what the Germans called economic autarky, being able to produce their own goods and not relying too heavily on imports. This was critical to withstand a British blockade to trade, a policy that had damaged Germany in the First World War. Germany would also need Lebensraum, or living space, that would facilitate the growing German population. Lebensraum was to be found in the east, and this meant Germany would have to expand into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and agricultural regions of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this new German Reich that was to be created was to be racially pure, containing only the Aryan race, free of Slavs and Jews of whom would have to leave or be eliminated. And it was also Germany's mission to launch a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism, an ideology and enemy that's home took the form of the Soviet Union. A war he thought would inevitably have to happen. The international system that had been envisaged was not able to cope. Without the support of the British and the United States' absence following a policy of non-interventionism, France was left alone to maintain and enforce the Treaty of Versailles, something it couldn't and didn't want to do alone. Held in Geneva, Switzerland, the disarmament conference provided a preview for how Hitler operated and what future Nazi policy would look like. Hitler instructed his representatives at the conference to state that Germany would completely disarm, if, and only if, France, Britain, Japan and the United States would do the same. This was an offer that Hitler correctly assumed would be denied, and so he went back to the German people and showed them how this conference was not about disarmament, but rather keeping Germany subjugated. And so in 1933, Hitler withdrew from the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference to the support of his people. In 1934, to the surprise of the international community, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with Poland, taking an ally away from France and weakening France's military positioning, as Germany was now free to the east. In March of 1935, Germany revealed it had been building an air force, the Luftwaffe, again breaking the Treaty of Versailles, with the justification being that Britain, France and Poland all had an air force and that Germany too needed to defend itself. 1 week later, Hitler declared his intentions to introduce conscription, to build an army of 500,000 men. Once again, the League of Nations protested, but no action was taken. The disarmament clauses outlined in the Treaty of Versailles had been destroyed. Then, in June of 1935, to France's horror, Britain had entered into a naval agreement with Germany. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement, in which Britain recognised Germany's right to build up its navy. They were to be allowed up to 35% of Britain's surface tonnage and a submarine fleet up to 60% that of Britain's. Britain had struck a deal, and in doing so had given up on Versailles, given up on disarmament, and began to show Hitler that a policy of appeasement was to be pursued. A year later, in March 1936, German troops were sent into the demilitarised Rhineland. The matter was referred to the League of Nations, which once again did nothing. Remilitarisation of the Rhine was the final nail in the coffin for the Treaty of Versailles and the international order. The treaty was now officially dead. France, in response to German occupation of the Rhine, constructed a Maginot Line along its eastern border. However, the fortification stopped at the Ardennes forest and did not extend across the Belgian frontier, the place at which Germany had entered during the Great War. The French were preparing for a war of the trenches and were not prepared for the motorised divisions that made German Blitzkrieg tactics so effective. Stalin at this time, threatened by German power and aggression, entered the Soviet Union into the League of Nations and also signed an agreement with Czechoslovakia, stating he would come to their aid if attacked, but only if the Western Allies would come to its defence first. This was to stop the West trying to push German aggression eastwards. Hitler wanted all German-speaking nations in Europe to be unified, especially his native homeland Austria. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany and Austria were forbidden to be unified, as the Allies hadn't fought 4 years to see a larger Germany. Austrian President Schuschnigg, knowing he would receive no help from Italy and that France and Britain would not interfere in Hitler's plans, resigned, and 2 days later, German troops marched into Austria unopposed. Hitler had successfully annexed Austria, under the guise of national self-determination as justification. After the successful reoccupation of the Rhineland and the annexation of Austria, Hitler turned to Czechoslovakia, of which 3 million people in the Sudetenland were of German origin. The Czech government hoped that Britain and France would come to its assistance in the event of a German invasion, but British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was intent on avoiding war. He made 2 trips to Germany in September and offered Hitler favourable agreements, but the Führer kept increasing his demands. On the 30th of September 1938, Hitler attended a meeting in Munich, accompanied by Britain, France and Italy, all of whom agreed that Hitler should have the Sudetenland, as long as he promised to go no further. The Soviets and the Czechs were not represented at the meeting, and realising that no country would come to their aid, Czechoslovakia were forced to surrender the Sudetenland to Germany. After the meeting, Chamberlain went to Hitler and asked him to sign a peace treaty between Great Britain and Germany, to which Hitler happily agreed. Upon his return to Britain, Chamberlain delivered his Peace in Our Time speech to cheering crowds. To people at the time, Neville Chamberlain was a great champion. The Munich Agreement had won the peace and war was averted. But from this, Hitler saw Europe as weak and unwilling to stand up to his demands. Winston Churchill, one of Chamberlain's greatest critics, said, "You were given the choice between war and dishonour. You chose dishonour and you will have war." Churchill was proven right when just half a year later, on the 15th of March 1939, German troops marched into Czechoslovakia. Once again, Hitler had broken an agreement. France and Britain then guaranteed Poland's safety, with Britain also beginning to rearm and install a highly secret radar system along its east coast. On August 23, 1939, the Germans and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact, which sent shockwaves across the world's diplomatic community. The signing of this pact for Hitler ended the prospect of a two-front war, which allowed for a greater taking of Poland, but for Stalin this bought him time, to rebuild the Red Army that he had purged. As the last days of summer arrived, there was a sense in Europe that war was imminent, and the sense was right. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, revolutionized warfare, and allowed an attacker to destroy an opponent before they were even mobilized. Through the use of tanks or panzers, German forces were able to quickly smash border defences and circle enemy troops. They were to be supported by tactical air power, the Luftwaffe, that provided close aerial support to ground operations. Using this tactic, Germany was able to quickly knock out opponents, allowing them to conduct operations without the total mobilisation of the economy and society, much like the First World War had required. The First World War was one of attrition, something Germany wasn't in the current position to win or endure. This new mode of warfare, therefore, was to be one of speed and efficiency. On September 1st, 1939, Germany, with 52 divisions and over 1 million men, made their way into Poland, attacking through the north and the south, destroying the Polish armed forces. Britain responded with an ultimatum to Germany to cease military operations. The ultimatum was ignored, and so France, Britain, Australia and New Zealand all declared war on Germany, with Neville Chamberlain broadcasting the announcement on radio. The German attack was led by 5 armoured divisions, containing 300 tanks apiece, followed by 4 motorised infantry divisions, carrying their artillery and equipment, with cover provided from the air by the Luftwaffe. Believing that the invasion would be stopped by British and French intervention, the Polish were slow to mobilise and poorly prepared to face the German onslaught. Upon mobilisation, the Poles sported 1.3 million men, however possessed outdated equipment and only a few tanks, with the German armoured and motorised divisions outnumbering the Polish 15-1. Equipment was so scarce and outdated for the Polish that cavalry squadrons were seen to be charging heavily armoured German tank divisions. The invasion had worked with greater speed and efficiency than planned, and by September 8th, Warsaw, the Polish capital, had been reached. Once Germany had broken Polish resistance, Stalin moved troops into Poland, being key to the launch of Operation Barbarossa. In April of 1940, Adolf Hitler made a huge strategic gamble. His plan was to send the whole strength of the German navy along the Norwegian coast, from Oslo to Narvik, to protect the coastal waterways. Swedish iron ore could then be safely transported to German blast furnaces, and German control of Norwegian waters would make an Allied blockade of Germany a lot harder. British discontent over the Norwegian campaign and an Allied withdrawal led to the resignation of Neville Chamberlain on the 10th of May 1940. His successor was appointed the same day, a man who throughout the 1930s had spoken out regarding German rearmament and Hitler's threat to the world, a man who went by the name of Winston Churchill. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany launches an attack against France, Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. French troops quickly position themselves along the Maginot Line, and the rest of the Allied soldiers positioned themselves along the Belgium and Luxembourg borders. As Belgium was neutral, Allied soldiers could not enter the country and prepare a defensive position, and so would have to wait for Germany to invade. Germany began their offensive in the early hours of the morning. With more than 1,000 fighters, bombers and dive bombers, they attacked Allied airfields, destroying their air force on the ground before they could even take flight, something that would be crucial in giving the Luftwaffe air superiority for the rest of the offensive. Just 3 hours after being attacked, Belgium permits Allied troops to enter the country. Due to the great mobility of German panzers and motorised infantry divisions, the Allied forces never had the time to establish a practical defence, and within the day, Luxembourg is captured. Sporting nearly 2.5 million men, the German invasion worked with great efficiency. 3 army groups were to be used for the invasion: Army Group A, B and C. Army Group B was tasked with defeating the Netherlands and then advancing into Belgium to keep the Allied forces in place. Army Group C were to attack through the Maginot Line, keeping those soldiers in place and protecting the flank of Army Group A. Comprising of 750,000 troops, Army Group A was by far the largest. They were to push through the Ardennes forest, a naturally fortified area, something the French were not expecting to be entered or breached. 41,000 vehicles successfully made their way through the Ardennes forest. The Germans then crossed the Meuse River and by May 15th capture Sedan. They then head west, cutting off and surrounding the entire Allied army that had advanced into Belgium. This unexpected push through the Ardennes would force Allied soldiers out of Belgium, with them having to withdraw to the port of Dunkirk to protect their flank. The future of the free world hung in the balance. Britain faced a perilous situation after the fall of France, and all that separated the Germans from yet another victory was the English Channel. The isolationist United States was an ocean away, which left only one man to make a decision that would change the course of human history. With the fighting over, Germany began to consider ways of resolving the question of how to deal with Britain. Hitler hoped that Churchill would come to his senses and sign a peace treaty, but if the British refused, Hitler's only option was to invade. Churchill then delivered his "We will fight on the beaches" speech. This famous speech transformed Churchill into a world statesman, outlining unequivocally he would never make peace with Hitler, but war was now to come. Germany had to plan an invasion of Great Britain. The invasion of France and Poland had taken months to plan, with every intricate detail of battle thought through, but the invasion of Britain, with orders from High Command, would have to be ready by August 15th, giving them just 1 month. The fighting was not over, however. The Blitz had now begun. British cities were bombed in night raids, and London was attacked every night for 57 consecutive nights bar one. And on November 10th, 1940, a 14th century Gothic cathedral in Coventry was obliterated. Children were evacuated to the countryside, and people living in London spent most nights sleeping in air raid shelters or in the London Underground. A blackout was enforced after darkness, where all sources of light had to be covered up, as to prevent the Germans from seeing where towns and homes were located. Over the course of the Blitz, which lasted 8 months and 5 days, just under 2 million homes were destroyed, and 40,000 civilians were killed, with 87,000 being seriously injured. But most importantly, the bombing had failed to demoralise the British into surrender. The full force of the German war machine was now to be turned against the Soviet Union. This war was to be won to the death, a clash of two ideologies, two forces of civilization in which only one could be victorious. Hitler hated communism, and victory over the Soviet Union would provide Germany with the abundant natural resources that would enable the German people to finally become the master race. Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's greatest gamble. Unable to defeat Great Britain in the west, Germany's armies were deployed to the east. Luckily for Hitler, the Red Army, the largest in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges during the 1930s. Tens of thousands of officers were shot or imprisoned, and inefficiency and a lack of coordination became widespread. Before the invasion began, and to secure Germany's southern flank, on April 6, 1941, Germany invaded the Balkans. 33 divisions entered Yugoslavia, and 6 days later they surrendered. Greece then fell, and Athens was captured within 3 weeks. Operation Barbarossa could now commence. Over 4 million men were to be deployed, accompanied by over 3,000 aircraft. 3 divisions were also to be used, much like the invasion of France. Army Group North would push through the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center was to advance to Moscow, and Army Group South would occupy the Ukraine. The Red Army was far larger. They had 2 million men along the Western Front and millions more in reserve. They also sported 20,000 tanks against Germany's 6,000, although they were older and less advanced. Germany versus the Soviet Union would therefore be a war between superior technology and speed versus sheer numbers. On June 22, 1941, the operation began at 3:15 am. The Luftwaffe attacked Soviet airfields while the ground invasion commenced. Hitler's panzers then pushed forward and within 2 days had penetrated more than 50 miles. The Red Army was no match, and tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners were rounded up. As July came, Blitzkrieg was successful as ever. Within a week, the panzers were at Smolensk, only a few hundred miles away from Moscow. It was here that the tanks would rest, so the rest of the army that often relied on horse-drawn carriages could catch up. Prisoners that had been captured along the way also began heading west to captivity, in which 2.5 million men would never return. Meanwhile, the German advance in the south was having troubles, and so Hitler ordered Army Group North to swing south to Kiev to provide help, to which his generals heavily objected. It would turn out to be a disastrous decision. Soviet manpower seemed to be endless, and the halt at Smolensk allowed Stalin to mobilize more than 16 million troops. And a new Soviet tank was headed towards the front line, the T-34, which was faster than the Panzer Mark IV. The remnants of Army Group North surrounded Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. But rather than capturing the city, the Germans decided to starve it. Starvation began, and more than 11,000 people died in November, and another 3,700 on one day in December alone. The siege lasted for more than 2 years, and by the end in 1944, over 1 million Soviets had been killed. Army Group Center now prepared for an offensive on Moscow, and on the 20th of September 1941 they began their assault. The panzers advanced, and even more Soviet troops were captured. But Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last. On October 8th, bad weather halted the German advance, and they were still 50 miles from Moscow. Hitler would now pay the price for sending troops south rather than advancing on Moscow earlier on in the year. Speed that gave German blitzkrieg tactics the advantage was now obsolete. The Soviet winter arrived. German forces, thinking the campaign would be over by summer, were underprepared. Tank engines would not start, weapons froze, and soldiers were frostbitten as they didn't have the proper clothing. And on December 5th, Germany halted its attack. Stalin then moved his armies from Siberia to the west. More than 30 divisions made their way, who were all well equipped and trained for fighting in the winter. By December, more than 500,000 extra men were in place. With additional support, the Soviets began a counterattack, driving German forces back. For the next 7 days, Soviet troops tore into German forces. Hitler ordered for there to be no more retreats. He told his forces they should fight, and if necessary, die where they stood. The German line held strong. For the next 4 months, the two sides fought, and Hitler hadn't got the quick results that he had wanted or planned. Hitler's army then moved south in search for oil, and began a campaign of securing Stalingrad. And so began one of the longest battles of the Second World War. The city had to be taken street by street, house by house, and room by room. But the Soviets too began to move troops and equipment southwards. More than 1 million men, 900 tanks, and more than 1,000 aircraft were moved to the battle zone and attacked the German flank. It was now the Germans who surrendered in their thousands. Over 100,000 men made their way to captivity, with only 5,000 eventually returning to Germany. Germany lost 300,000 men in the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Soviets around the same numbers. But the tide of the battle had begun to turn. The Soviet army continued its success. German troops began to withdraw to protect their flank, and the Soviet winter offensive saw them gain lots of territory. Over the course of a few months, Germany had lost over 1 million men. The Soviet army mobilized further and drove back the German lines at Kursk. Never again would the German war machine launch an offensive in the east. Across the globe, on the 26th of November 1941, a Japanese carrier fleet set sail in the northern Pacific. Its target was a US naval base in Hawaii, which went by the name of Pearl Harbor. What had been confined to a mainly European war was now to be transformed into the deadliest global conflict in human history.